Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the this meeting of City Council Scrutiny Committee. Item 1 on the agenda is apologies. I've received apologies from Councillor Huntley and Councillor Everett, and Councillor Maxwell is here for Councillor Huntley, so welcome. Item 2, public questions and petitions, with none of those. Item 3, any declarations of interest? Councillor Driver.
Yeah, I've got one concerning the report. I'm just reading about the council tax reduction scheme, and which I received. But by start saying, I think this is a fantastic idea. I think this would be great. We should keep it for years and years and years. I think that might be a declaration of interest, not to say anything like that.
I'm going to get some guidance from the monitoring officer there. Thank you.
Obviously, we're not making a decision in relation to the scheme itself tonight, nor are we specifically discussing your circumstances, Councillor Driver. So I think whilst we can note that, you can still take part.
Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Councillor Thomas.
Item 6, there's mention of the advice industry giving advice to the hardest hit on the welfare changes, on the welfare rights worker employed in that industry, and then the financial inclusion consortium.
Yeah, thank you. Presumably the same advice stands. We're not explicitly making any decisions today on that.
Yeah, as long as you wouldn't have a pecuniary interest, and you can retain an open mind in the discussions, and you'll find participate.
No opinion.
Thank you very much for that then. So we move on to item 4, minutes of the Scrutiny Committee for the 21st of October 2010. Any members who wish to make a comment on those, please? Councillor Galvin.
Thank you. Just a couple of sort of corrections, one of which might need a bit of input from you, Chair, when it's corrected. Paragraph for efficient energy appliances probably should be energy efficient. And then the next line, Council Into said that. I'm not sure what that means. Next line, be become. Next paragraph said that the airport's plans will be to be reviewed. That's come from you, but I'm not sure what that refers to. You're watching back. The next paragraph after that, in corridors, in adaptations to the city. Again, that doesn't actually, that's a bit infelicitous in terms of meaning. I wasn't clear what it meant. And then the next page, 9, the recommendation was actually the base data set. Rather than is not comprehensive, it needs to say does not include production, consumption, shipping and aviation. So it'll be the same length basically, you just need to take out is not comprehensive and have the words does not include production, consumption, shipping or aviation. And that was what was being asked.
Okay, thank you. So there's in essence, there's 2 things that you proposed there, one of which is dealing with some subtle changes to correct some wording anomalies, which I think I can just deal with directly with relevant officers. I think the second one about adding some additional things at the end of the recommendation, I think I would probably need that to be formally agreed by as a change by the committee. Do I take that as a formal proposal from you to insert those additional words?
Yeah, they're replacement words, so rather than is not comprehensive, you can just have does not include production, consumption, shipping and aviation. And that's what was said in the meeting. So.
Let's take some guidance from the monitoring officer there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a recommendation from the committee. Councillor Galvin feels the committee made a more detailed recommendation that's put down here, and as it's an item that would be proposed through as a recommendation, then you're right, the committee would want to take a vote to support that, and they're entitled to do so.
Do I need to get a seconder for that change?
I'd always like this proposal to be seconded.
Could I have a seconder for that change then, please? Councillor Carlo and Councillor Giles, did you want to say something? Were you trying to second?
I was only going to say, I think that clarifies what was agreed, so I'm happy to support that.
Okay. Well, we've got a proposer and a seconder, and someone has spoken in favour. Can I take just everyone who's in favour of that? Show your hands, please. Great, thank you. So that clarification has been made. That's good, thank you. So, are we now happy to take those minutes as agreed? An indication, please. Yeah, great, thank you very much. So that is the minutes dealt with. So we'll then move on to item 5, which is an update on the Norwich Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. Councillor Scrutiny, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this was my first meeting, so I'm still catching up with the process involved at NHOSC, and we had 3 items at this meeting, all really interesting. First was eating disorders, and particularly young people. We had a report on that and a fairly long discussion for around an hour. My contribution, I asked a question about the in-reach into acute hospital facilities for supporting young people that may be subject to further trauma involving tube feeding. And we heard that there is significant support provided to them. There was an agreement that the trauma is significant and worth minimising. And we heard that mercifully numbers of such patients are low and reducing, although numbers of people with eating disorders have increased, partially as a result of COVID. The other item, main item, was the placement of Norfolk and Waveney mental health patients in beds which are outside of NSFT's geographic area. Within the geographic area, but outside of the patient's home locality, and within the geographic area, but outside the Trust's facilities. And there's an increase in the number of people in such beds. One of the reasons for a current issue is Helston Hospital facility being closed, so I asked what the situation was with that, whether it's on track to reopen in December. And whether the suggestion that it may become a single gender unit, in this case for women, was going to go ahead, and whether there'd be a consultation on that. So I'm told that it is on track, and consultation the decision hasn't been made yet on whether it will become a single gender unit, so we'll need an update on that. And in terms of housing for that item, there was a suggestion from the Chair and a clinician in response to questions that district councils, especially Norwich, where we have the highest demand, are largely responsible for high numbers of people in beds where they're fit enough for discharge. I highlighted the wider demand on housing in Norwich compared with other district councils, as we have thousands on the waiting list, but agreed to return to City Hall with some questions on that item. And it turns out actually they're misinformed about the complexities of the service, and I've received a comprehensive answer from our housing operations manager, which I'll report back to NHOSC at the first opportunity. Last item was a report on and review of Corston Park Hospital safeguarding, where there was some tragic circumstances where 3 of their 3 people there died. We had a report on that, and that was a verbal report. So that concludes my report.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stootley. I gather that, well, I'd like to thank you for your sterling efforts, I think, in trying to get the views of this committee and this council across. I gather that was perhaps quite challenging sometimes with trying to ask some questions.
It appears it will be, but I'll continue.
Thank you. I also gather that at the January meeting that perhaps is it looking at access to primary care and dentistry? I think that's something that will be certainly of interest to members here.
Yes, that's coming back as an item. I believe it's been in a main item before, and this is a follow-up report. Hopefully we'll get an opportunity to ask some questions, and I'll report back on that. Yeah. But of course, if members here have questions that they'd like me to ask, please submit them to me.
Okay, thank you for that. I had Councillor Osborne first, and then Councillor Galvin. Councillor Osborne.
Thanks. Yeah. On the topic of eating disorders, obviously I raised that as a question in the last meeting, so I didn't actually realise that it was on the work programme. I would like to input into that. Is there going to be any follow-up on that, and is there any work that the committee is doing looking at eating disorders in over 18s as well as children? It's one of the main issues is actually the transition from under 18 from CAM services to adult services.
Thank you. Yes, I think eating disorders amongst all age groups were discussed. I think we were specifically looking at young people, but there's some data in the report which I can forward to you for ease shortly, where all age groups are covered, and there's some interesting graphics that highlight the problem. The report, the committee is also online on the YouTube channel of the Norfolk County Council if anyone wishes to watch it.
Thank you for that. Councillor Galvin.
Thank you, and thanks for going and bringing the report back. In September, there was an item that came about the vulnerable adults primary care service, which has replaced a service that existed before. It's obviously based in the city. I've watched the report, and I've watched the meeting and read the report, and I've got a series of questions about it. So I guess I can submit them to NHOSCA and you can look at asking them. I don't think we were represented at that meeting. The city wasn't represented. Obviously, the service is based in the city. So it would be good if we could bring that back to NHOSCA and ask the questions that need asking.
Yes, certainly. As I catch up with this, I'll try and get as much information for you as I can. But in the meantime, if you have questions, send them to me, and I'll take the appropriate action with them and get in contact with the officers at County Hall.
Thank you. I expect we weren't represented because there was that period where we had a sub, but we didn't have a main attendee, and because there was no main attendee in post, they wouldn't allow the sub to attend, which seems slightly perverse. But that was the rule, so that led to us not being represented. I know Councillor Giles was eager to attend, but unable to. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. Thank you for the report and the questions. So that takes us on to item 6. Oh, Councillor Giles, you have a question.
I was only going to say, if people do have any questions or ideas ahead of the NCCSP meeting in December, please do drop me an email or a line.
The Safety Partnership panel. So thank you for that. So item 6 is the emerging new social inclusion agenda following COVID-19. I'd like to welcome Ramona Herban, I think, is going to present the report. Helen Chamberlain, Rachel Sowerby, Ruth Newton, Kate Price, Vicky Bristow, and Councillor Waters is here as a replacement for Councillor Davis, who's unable to be here. So welcome everyone, and Ramona, if you want to outline the report for us, and then I know members have got questions that they'd like to fire at you. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So there are a lot of officers here because this is a very wide-ranging report. Essentially, it tries to set out the Council's approach to reducing inequalities across a number of different areas over many years, obviously concentrating most on the recent past, and then also talking about how some of the lessons we've learned through that work and some of the data we've got and the relationships we've got were used particularly in the early stages of COVID and the further lessons we've learned from that. So it particularly looks at locality-based work in what we call the RETA areas, the areas where we've identified greatest disadvantage over the years, also at economic and financial inclusion work, at the council tax reduction scheme, food poverty, fuel poverty, digital inclusion, and then the more statutory work around equality, diversity and inclusion. So my colleagues here are experts on various different aspects of that, if you have any questions. I think part of the wide-ranging nature of the paper is reflected in the fact that actually I think you have items coming to future scrutiny meetings, particularly on equality and on the economy and inequality as relating to that. So I'm sure that there will be threads that come up from the discussion today that we can pick up in future meetings as well. I think the paper lays out, as we are all sadly aware, that COVID's had a lot of the worst effects on people who are already facing significant disadvantage. Our reaction to COVID has been built in partnership with communities and with the voluntary community, the social enterprise sector, and we've been able to move quickly in a lot of ways because of the strong relationships we have there. I think it also sets out how we want to build on that in the future and become increasingly better at listening to communities with our work on citizen participation, which is being developed at the moment. So the last part of the paper really sets out our very early thinking on how we want to draw these strands together a bit more as officers to make sure that where we have got really good data and lessons learned coming from these various different aspects, that we are regularly bringing that together and that we're learning from that and applying the same, where we have successes, where we have principles that we work out are effective, that we make the most of that in all different areas of the council's work. So we haven't developed a detailed plan on that yet, but the idea is that we look at the existing Reducing Inequalities Action Plan, we update that, we bring together the officers who are leading on all the aspects of that regularly so that we can learn from each other and we can join up, identify future opportunities. And that we then try and, I think it has not been completely agreed yet, but we report publicly and regularly on that. Potentially annually, and at that point we can kind of look at the action plan each year and think, is this still right with changing circumstances? Can we show what progress we've made, what we've learned and what we want to do with the year ahead? So I think that lays out what we've got in the paper and be interested to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Ramona, for that. And I want to, I guess, begin by saying actually, it's, I'm sat here behind this banner which talks about Living Wage Week, and living wage, I think, is so important as being part of helping to reduce inequalities. And Councillor Waters spoke on Tuesday evening very passionately about living hours and the work that Living Wage Foundation is doing, and whether how the city's involved with that. I don't know whether, Councillor Waters, I could just invite you to say, give your brief overview of living wage, perhaps in the context of social inclusion, before I can then invite the rest of the committee for questions.
Kind of you to invite me to do that. Going back some time now, we used to produce anti-poverty strategies, and they were very important documents, but they were kind of the stubborn figures about poverty. And one of the reasons we went for the living wage was actually ending in work poverty and getting resources into families and opportunities to enjoy a reasonable standard of living. We've had the advantage of the Living Wage Foundation coming to provide us with some extra resource, and I thought at the launch earlier in the week there was a lot of energy in the room. I mean, Michael Newey's very passionate speech about the ethical responsibilities of organisations and businesses of whatever character to make sure that they've got a workforce which is well supported. I mean, it's about better pay, but it's also about good working conditions. I think we've expanded, beyond the kind of the magic figure, which this year is £9.90. And we've had, I think, another 13 businesses join in 2021, which, given the context of COVID and difficulties that businesses have been facing, that's a really uplifting figure. But there are big structural changes in our economy. So, a million people on 0 hours contracts, like platform work, regular work. There are issues which I think emerged from COP26, which was about we transition to a low carbon society and economy. What does a fair transition look like? And I think in our thinking, and this is why we've gone for the idea of a living wage city, 3-year programme to really drive the living wage. I think to the point where it becomes the norm to pay the living wage, and so building up that momentum. And so that was something that I said something about at the meeting, but there's been a serious bit of work going on to pull all of that together, produce a document which passed muster with the Living Wage Foundation, and then we can put the action plan into good effect. So I think this is just one very important strand, which I think breaks through mitigants, important mitigants. They do make a difference, but actually we want to sort of shift the sort of dynamic, the sort of structural framework in a direction where people have a decent income. And the reality is that pay levels have got worse. We have some of the worst pay levels in relative terms since the Edwardian era. So we've got a big challenge ahead of us. So I think this is a key element which has a number of beneficial ramifications to some of the issues raised in this document.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for the context. So over to members for questions. I think Councillor Driver caught my eye first, then Councillor Osborne, Councillor Galvin, before the McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. I've just got to come back on what I was saying about living wage and what you mentioned, Chair. Is there any data to say that people who are getting a living wage are still using food banks and stuff? As we hear about people having 2 or 3 jobs but still deprived and using food banks and other social security and other money. Is there any data done on that, especially in Leighton where you've just done the inclusion bit? And the other bit is, thinking about moving this on to 6 other wards or 6 other areas in Norwich, which I think will be a good idea. Can I make sure that the resources that you put into this one to start with, will they still be there? And how much resources will you be taking out of this case study, which we studied in my ward in Leighton, to move on and help in the other areas? Or will the resources still be there to look after the people you already started? Because there's nothing worse than getting people's hopes up and working on and then suddenly collapsing and start again.
Thank you.
Yeah. Living wage, and you're right, Keith. If you pay the living wage for 5 hours work a week, then you're down the food bank. So what's been augmented in terms of the Living Wage Foundation strategy is living hours, and also living pensions, living wage pensions, because pension provision, basic pension provision in this country is appalling. So it's expanding that across the whole sort of framework of working practices and income.
Thank you for that. Any officers able to pick up the point about the expanding the pilot and what that will mean in terms of stretching resources?
Hopefully this works, yes. So the Lakenham pilot was based on finite amount of money, because obviously we don't have a huge amount of resource to do things on a regular basis. So we're always looking for opportunities for funding. But what we have learned from exactly what you're talking about, Councillor Driver, is the more we put resource in without thinking about the legacy and without thinking about what happens after, the actual worse we tend to leave those communities. You parachute things in, you have a cliff edge at the end, and we've definitely learned that that's not the way forward. So it's definitely built into the way we want to try and work in those communities, is that rather than parachuting in as service, parachuting in something that will go, we would rather work with those communities and build the resilience in them that will still be there after any funding legacy is gone, but also creating structures within those communities that, should we be able to get more grant funding, that we can hang on that,
we put it back into that same structure. So when you've created a network, like the really strong network that is in Lakenham now, if we get funding in Lakenham, we come back to that network and we make sure we're constantly building on the people who are there and supporting them as we go. So we are very, very conscious of it. We will always take the opportunity if there is that short-term funding, if we think it can make a positive difference without it being a deficit. But it's a difficult challenge to overcome in the way the funding world works, but we are very conscious and trying very hard to make that work.
So are you saying that all the resources what are in Lakenham at the moment will still be there when you move into the other 6 areas?
The resources in Lakenham from that initial one have been, correct me if I'm wrong, gone for quite some time.
Yeah.
So we're still obviously working with the enabling team, we still work with a lot of the people who are there. You probably know Simon Bloom in Lakenham.
Yep.
We still work really, really closely with a lot of the projects that are going there, and we still look to invest in those areas. But there is no currently direct resource attributed to Lakenham. But it is one of the areas in our recent CRF bid that will, again, hang the money that we have got into that connection of local networks. But there isn't actually direct resource working directly in Lakenham at the moment. It's just our kind of business as usual, supporting the legacy of what came from that project.
So the council will put in more resources for the other 6 areas and less into Lakenham, which is one of the most deprived areas in the whole city?
No. So basically the idea of the areas is that wherever we have the opportunity to bring in additional resource, we bring it into those 7 areas, into whichever one is appropriate to bring into. So like I say, with the CRF, we picked several of the areas, Lakenham being one of them, because they were appropriate for that funding. Where we brought in some for participatory budgeting from the CCG, we did that in Heartsease because it was really appropriate to the data in Heartsease and the networks that were there. So it's not about taking away from any one area, it's about having all of these areas with equal weighting in our minds, and some of the smaller areas that don't necessarily come up as wholly readers. But looking at the opportunities we have available to us and making sure they all get an equal, footing on that. So it's not about going into one and then going, we finished you, and then moving into something else.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Osborne.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to pick up on the living wage. First of all, after that, my sort of questions broadly on citizen participation, which Ramona mentioned at the start there, on the regions and the overlap with, say, the neighbourhoods areas, on health inequalities and on joining up between council teams are the sort of areas I want to talk about. But I'll just ask a question on the living wage first, which is, sorry James, I'm slightly stealing your thunder on this because we talked about this on Tuesday, but what you said made me think that a lot of I would be interested to know how many employers that are accredited living wage employers were employing people on low wages to start with, or whether they are businesses that are actually paying people significantly above the living wage already, and whether, how many of the businesses that are signing up are in the foundational sector, hospitality, catering, cleaning, and so on, and whether we can do more to encourage those businesses. Should I go on with my other questions, or should I?
Well, hang on that, and because of the point you've just made, I'm just going to declare an interest. So, I'm a director of a company which is living wage accredited, but which pays significantly above the living wage, and does it because it supports the aims and objectives of the Living Wage Foundation. I just wanted to get that there so that now we can move on to who would like to pick up Councillor Osborne's question.
So, in the profile of a workforce, if you take, for example, housing associations, take Broadland Housing, for example, it will have a lot of people, professional people, who will be, comfortably above the living wage. But it will also have people who are cleaners, security staff, sort of lower-end admin, by some sort of pay definition rather than the skill sets that people have, people who do maintenance work, and in some cases those may well be provided by the companies. So what has to happen in terms of the sort of living wage journey is that all your directly employed staff have to be paid the living wage before you can get accreditation. And then you've got to make compliant all of your procurement contracts and so on. So Stuart Wright from Aviva, who's been a very significant player in the Living Wage Foundation, said that when they decided to go living wage compliant, you know, it wasn't easy. I mean, they've got a big estate, they've got lots of contracts, and they had to work over a time frame. And the time frame is usually a year to 18 months to make all of those roles compliant. So there will be, I think, in every company, even very, like the big, like PwC, and living wage employers. But the beneficiaries of the living wage are clearly people who clean the offices, do the security, and so on. So it's lifting that low-paid workforce and often insecure workforce, and put them in that frame.
Thank you for that. Councillor Osborne, would you like to ask your other questions?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just on that, I think you mentioned, Alan, on Tuesday that there'll be a further 16 companies joining the living wage, something like that. I'd be interested to know, how many workers does that translate into? What's the real time, the real equivalent of?
I mean, just to say, there's something like 8,000. There's 53 companies. What's interesting is a number of them are SMEs, social enterprises. It's often the smaller companies who make the breakthrough, and it's the larger organisations which have to be nudged along. And we're doing quite a lot of work with the football club. And the trouble is, people keep disappearing, so you build a relationship, and then you've got to start again. But I think that's the key to it. I mean, the other thing, as a general point, of course, why have we got living wage campaigns? Is because wages councils were abolished. Those were built into the beginning of the 20th century, and then dispatched by various conservative governments. So there's obviously another dynamic here, which is about the role of trade unions, but there's also a sort of a regulatory role that governments need to play in terms of putting a floor underneath the wages and conditions of different groups of workers.
Yeah, I guess just in future, if we are going to have a report on living wage in future, if we come back to this topic, it would be interesting to see the breakdown of which companies. I'll just ask about the Rita's question, if that's all right, Kate. Obviously, we've spoken before about sort of overlap between the Rita's and the safer neighbourhoods areas, and certainly in Mancroft, in my ward, there's one area that overlaps with the Rita and the area that Tim Baker is working in, and one area where Tim is working that isn't a Rita. I'm just wondering if there's could be future efforts to try and integrate those or link those up more, because obviously Tim's work on the Safer Neighbourhoods coordinator is focused on safety, but a lot of that actually ties in with building community, and that's just been really successful, taking that sort of really local focused approach of looking at what do people want to improve in their area, what do we think is missing in their area, and getting people out and talk to their neighbours and engage has actually been a really good way of reducing isolation as well. So yeah, I guess the question is that going to be joined up? Related to that is the link up with housing teams. So some of the feedback we get as board councillors is often people don't actually know who their housing officers are, and general. There's certainly when we've been around Mancroft with housing teams, they haven't necessarily always known what's some of the safety aspects or what's going on in terms of the Rita's areas, and that's not a criticism of officers. Obviously, it's just trying to make sure that there's more coordination. Obviously, I don't see what goes on and who's doing what inside the council, but yeah, that's the feedback that we get from residents as well, is they don't always know who to turn to if they're in trouble for any reason or if they've got issues to raise.
Okay.
I'll do my best on that. So I think you've come to some of the crux of why we've designed some of the conversations work that's come out of the readers' work as we have. Because there's so much going on with just us as a council, never mind all the other stakeholders we work with, in terms of people who are out there having conversations with our residents. And a big part of what we want to try and achieve with that work, which is no small ambition, is to find ways to capture those conversations and share them together. Because there's probably an incredible minefield of information in most of our officers' heads that they don't necessarily have a place to share it as well as they might. Or it sits in one particular service and they do a great job with it, but we don't always find out about that. So I think Ramona kind of alluded to the fact that we've had a reducing inequalities steering group for some time, but that's quite wide, external stakeholders, and not always in place to discuss slightly more in-depth Norwich City Council type stuff. So by putting in place a sort of internal reducing inequalities group, we can really start to make the most of those connections that we've got between us and make sure that everything any one of us is hearing is shared across the board so that we can all benefit from that input and understand how our services fit together. It was certainly one of the really interesting pieces of feedback from officers as a result of the very early COVID response, was they got to work with loads and loads of people in the council who they didn't know and develop relationships across the council with people they can now go to and understand better what their job is. So I think there's a really good piece of work we can do within this about understanding each other's roles and making sure we're complementing them as well.
Can I just ask about the reducing inequalities, what's called boards, the steering group? Is there tenant representation on that?
Not tenant, because that one is specifically for stakeholders and organisations. There is VCSE representation and there's representation from our housing team. And we have, I don't think on that particular board, housing associations, but there are some on the community development network where they're working closely with their tenants as well. The idea is that the work we do in communities is where we get the individual's point of view as opposed to that particular strategic board.
Thank you for that. I know, Councillor Osborne, you've got more questions, but I'm going to just bring in some other members first and we'll come back to you. So, Councillor Galvin, you go next, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. It's really interesting to read it all. There's so much that could be said. So, and I'm new back on Scrutiny, so forgive me if I ask questions that aren't as stupid. Or I should know the answer to, but I just wanted to pick up on the meters. It looks to me from the heat maps in the appendix, I think it's A, that, you know, in some places the meters, like page 40, in part 1, you know, it would appear to be slightly in the wrong place. They don't really match up with those heat maps of need, and so my question around that is sort of the process around this. I think Keith raised it first, so it's good to have that focus, obviously, and you needed to do something. But what's the long-term strategy on that? So, and a wider question on that is the long-term. I can see they're an initiative, but the danger comes, as we know, with lots of initiatives, as you outlined, that come and go and leave areas perhaps no different and perhaps even not improved. The area I represented before, there was a huge amount of money, £38.5 million went in as a noun project, and at the end of that there wasn't, the report said, you know, it hadn't made, money doesn't always solve everything, and we need to kind of record what money's spent and how it's spent with communities. So the question I guess I'd ask is, what's the long-term strategy around meters? What's the process by which the council listens to the community on them? And what's the process of really measuring how they work? So those are broad questions, I know, but I'd like to see that sort of discussed. It's a bit about a kind of audit of effect, I guess.
Thank you for that. Two who can pick up, Ruth. Thank you.
I think I'm going to start this one and then I might hand over to Kate for the second part of that. So in terms of how we defined the geography, how we came to those areas in the first place, we went through quite an extensive exercise with various other partners, so Active Norfolk, County Council and health partners, after doing the Lakeland pilot, where everyone had agreed it was a successful approach. So we got hold of as much data as we could, normally by ward basis, and did an analysis of which areas the outcomes across a whole range of areas tended to be worse, to then pinpoint the wards that was facing the sort of highest levels of disadvantage, and then in conjunction with our housing team and community enabling team, drew out street by street which parts of those wards we wanted to focus on, because one of the learning from Lakeland was that we wanted to be really specific rather than just taking a whole ward approach. So that was how they originally came about. The maps that you've got were our look post the sort of initial lockdown of what data what we'd learned and whether the approach, the areas that we picked were still the right one. So it did, as you suggested, kind of highlight a couple of other areas that we definitely want to keep on the radar. But I think the feeling was that the route areas that we picked originally were still ones that we wanted to focus on, at least initially. Do you want me to go on to the second part of that question? So in terms of the long-term strategy, as Kate had said, the learning from Lakeland was very much that a lot of areas have had money go in and out, and the whole idea of the REACH approach was to bring partners together to use what core resource we had to create a kind of platform in those areas, accepting that money would come in and out, but what can we do to build the capacity of community organisations and partners to work together without funding. So the Lakeland pilot actually had no funding originally, but showed that we could bring in money by working together. So the whole strategy, I think, of the REACH areas is that partnership-based approach, which a lot of partners have now really bought into. We've got a lot of core resource being targeted from a whole range of partners, and as Kate said, as project funding is coming up, we're seeing that go into the REACH areas. And also a kind of coming together of ways of working, a real acceptance that we need to work with residents in those areas, hear what communities' experiences are, which is where the conversations work comes in, and sort of work collectively together to address the issues. So we're now seeing REACH partners pooling budgets and starting to think about shared outcomes. So your point about how we judge success is really difficult, but we're starting to get to the beginnings, I think, of what a shared outcome framework might look like if we were to say collectively what we're trying to achieve, and ideally in the long term have bigger pots of money to sort of cross organisations to actually do something more significant. But hopefully without any money, the idea is still that with our core resource we can work better together in those areas to listen to residents and communities and to do more with the resource that we've got.
A follow-up.
Yes, so thank you very much. So there is a shared outcome framework emerging, and will it include input from communities and citizens? Will it be co-created, that shared outcome framework? Because I'd like to see a kind of recommendation around that to support that work, if that's something that's...
Yeah, so we've got a very draft sort of outcome framework, which was we've discussed with partners, which is very much about the bottom layer of outcomes being about building community capacity and understanding what communities, what issues there are for communities, what assets there are, and then from there looking at all of the different partners' outcomes, which broadly sit under a reducing inequalities banner. So they're all ultimately connected, but how can we start to sort of pin those down? So yes, there's a draft framework which we're still discussing and sort of pinning down, and then project by project we tend to have outcomes frameworks, and that the community's conversation work hopefully will feed into that, which will be where the community views link up.
Thank you for that. It's Councillor Galvin sort of prompted an interesting a question I guess had earlier, when one looks at these maps and you look at the hotspots and you pick up your own ward, and I think to myself, well, on Appendix E, it talks about not enough food for 48 hours hotspots, and from an Eton perspective, that appears to be Waitrose. And I'm interested about how we get to that blob of data that includes Waitrose and the cellar house, and that's a hotspot for not enough food for 48 hours. But maybe that's more of a throwaway question than anything else. So I've got Councillor Fulton McAllister next, please.
Cool, thank you, Chair. So I'm really pleased to hear Alan talk about the important role that wages boards used to play. Unfortunately, we don't have those anymore, and it's actually led to a lot of the poverty that we see at the moment, because we know the best way of lifting people out of poverty is through well-paid, unionised work. With regard to the council's ability to use the contracting process to further improvements in terms and conditions, and we've been excellent at doing so through the living wage. I'd like to know the legal ability for us to be able to consider things like ruling out companies using contracts with zero hours contracts, because if you're on a living wage, that's fine, but you need to be able to work enough hours to actually make that wage something you can live on. If you're on a living wage, you still need to be able to have that security of employment. And there's other things as well, which we could explore, such as only contracting to unionised workforces, which would hopefully become a virtuous circle of improving the conditions for those workers, which would then ensure that they can put more back into the local economy, pushing up a lot of other areas' standards of living. So it's really a question focused on whether that would be something that we would legally be able to do. I would hope so, given we've been able to include living wage stipulations that we've introduced, and also whether it would be something that we could practically do, certainly on some of the most pernicious of issues, such as the use of 0 hours contracts.
Thank you. Helen, can you pick that up, please?
I can start the answer. I won't be able to answer all of it. I think there is absolutely a focus, obviously, in our work, thinking through our actions as an anchor institution, to think about how we use our contracts and how we use various other levers that we have in the city to make sure that we are driving up the objectives that we have around inequality in other areas. Whether we have a legal ability to do that onto contracts, I don't know. Leo may know, but if not, we will come back to you on that one.
Potentially we may have to, I think there may have to be an answer that's given after the meeting. I think that's the way to handle that.
That's really helpful.
Thank you. Next we have, I'll just list the hands that I've seen. I've got Councillor Carlo next, then Councillor Vaughan Thomas, then Councillor Driver, then Councillor Galvin, then Councillor Osborne, Councillor Maxwell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've got a simpler version of Councillor Galvin's question. And that is whether inequalities identified in the report are getting better or worse in Norwich following the various interventions. Because we've got a lot of information in the report, but longer term, it's not a very clear picture. Obviously, it's a dynamic picture because population changes over time, and the context changes all the time as well. Obviously, the reduction in universal credit has no doubt increased inequality, particularly in relation to food and fuel. So one of my further questions, is there any scope for the council actually giving people £20 a week to selected individuals in region areas such as single parents that they can use on food or fuel. I know of a couple of residents who really have been faced with the choice of feeding their families or heating their homes. Then the local information is really interesting as well and really encouraging. I wanted to ask whether the various agencies have worked together, and I'm sure they probably have, because I think it's come to Scrutiny some years ago, where everything is done to ensure that individuals receive their full entitlement to benefits of all kinds, be it pension, credit, or whatever. The additional pupil premium for income for Harford primary school is very encouraging. I wondered if that exercise has been repeated for all primary schools in Norwich, because obviously it was a big chunk of the money going into Lakenham. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was across a couple of specialisms, so I'm going to take your first bit and pass on to Ruth, if that's okay. So in terms of inequalities improving, it's always an exceptional challenge. A lot of the sort of data we're looking at is the sort of data that's harvested once every 10 years, and it's really challenging. And it's also challenging when you're working individually with people not to overburden them with evaluation, because the last thing we want to do is sit them down and go, right, tell us everything now, and then again in 3 months, and then we'll see if we fixed it. So we've been trying really, really hard to look at what our proxy measures are for whether we're making an improvement. And it's always going to be exceptionally difficult, exactly as you say, to say we might have made massive strides in Heartsease and it might have all been wiped out by the universal credit cuts. We'll never quite know. It's one of those very intangible things. So what we're trying to do through the pilot work is understand what can we measure, what can we be more sure on, what bits have we got control over. So a lot of the things, there will be elements where we will be able to say, we worked with residents, we understood what they wanted, we understood their priorities for an area, and as a result of knowing these priorities, we've used our resource differently, and this is the outcome that's had. So they'll definitely, I think as Ruth alluded to earlier, the individual projects can have quite specific outcome goals. Those wider ones are exceptionally challenging, and often ones that you don't necessarily see significant change until you're talking about generational shifts. But we're trying to work with partners to understand what type of data is collected more frequently, where we might be able to at least show correlation, if not causation, so that we can start to show if that's happening across all the regions and not the others, maybe we can take some credit for that. But it's quite a delicate, difficult process. So we're trying to understand what we can control, what we can measure, is where we can best start so that we can be honest about the impact that we've had. In terms of your point about giving cash within the REITs, the only thing I can say is we will be having the household support fund over winter, where people who we are working with will be able to say if they're struggling, and we'll be able to support them. Ideally, we want to try and support them with things that will get them out of that in the longer term, as opposed to just continually meet a need. It's been one of the biggest challenges over COVID is we've been able, through the fact we've had rather large budgets for food, to just sort of meet a need. But we've always had to be really conscious that it's not about keeping that person in crisis and keeping that sticking plaster on. It's trying to get them into that next step. So we've always, and Nick, you'll speak about how brilliant they are, I'm sure, but NCAN have been amazing. We always refer people into that. And with the household support fund, we want to try and take the same approach where, yes, we might meet your initial crisis. Are there things we can do for you within that fund that are going to help you longer term? What things can we help you bring those costs down? So we'll have a temporary element of that, but we're trying to use it as best we can to mitigate some of the longer term problems. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Ruth.
Just to answer your specific questions on the benefits take-up work in Lakenham, so definitely benefits take-up and advice generally was a really core part of the conversations we were having locally. So from those conversations we started the first social prescribing project in Tuxford Surgery, which then led to the model which was rolled out in Norwich using county council funding, which is now funded through health money. We did try and do some wider advice work, which was less successful using schools and other locations. But I know that we worked with Citizens Advice and the other NCAM partners, and I know they took a lot of that learning on in their wider work. And as opportunities have come up since then, so for example, in the Wenson project through the opportunity area, we've trialled using the NCAM referral tool in schools, because that was one of the things that we learned from the Labour pilot that we wanted to try. So it's kind of a learning process where as other opportunities have come up, we've tried to work with the partners to try new approaches. On the pupil premium stuff, again, because of the success of the work in Lakenham, that was rolled out. County Council funded us to mail out across the city soon after the pilot. So yes, that it is definitely an approach of sort of trying things where they work, trying to build on them and replicate them in other areas.
Can I just come in briefly on that one? Sorry. I just want to pick up, I know you mentioned fuel. So we do have a very small pot of charity funding that we use to assist people who are in sort of fuel crisis, unable to heat their homes. But as Kate was saying, it's part of a wider package of identifying those people in crisis, giving them that small-time emergency support, and then going forwards to help them get onto a better tariff, improve their heating situation, improve their housing situation. So it is sort of there as part of that wider package in regards to fuel.
Thank you for that. Councillor Carlo.
On the fuel issue, can I just come back and pick up something that was in the minutes of the last meeting? Because actually something which would really help people with fuel poverty is to retrofit their homes. So we bring the bills right down, both heating and lighting, to have active renewable energy and obviously energy rating a standard fabric. At the last meeting, it was said that there will be a review of the Housing HRA business plan with an objective for the council's housing stock to become carbon neutral. Obviously, that would be really helpful, not only in terms of carbon neutrality, but also in terms of fuel poverty. So I really hope that the council will look seriously, or not just look seriously, but actually will actively work on developing a retrofitting strategy for its council homes. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Councillor Vaughan-Thomas, next please.
Thank you, yes. Thank you for the report, really good. It's a delight to read. Good examples of community cohesiveness for people on low and no income. But the dog that's not barking in it is the private sector, and I'm pleased Councillor Waters introduced the living wage, and that's the divide between the public and the private sector. And I've talked to private sector who make donations, really good. As an extension of that cohesiveness, Tesco's donating money, Waitrose donating food through Fair Share, which is obviously fantastic. But it's still the products or produce which they can't sell or come to the end of their shelf line. It's a bit like someone standing next to someone at an ATM and asking for money when they've taken money out. You're still having to beg, and we're talking about people on low incomes, people who are working and going to food banks. So it's not just about having to beg for the food, even though they might be working. It's integrating with the private sector, not just as something that's like the crumbs that have fallen off the table. The living wage does actually, I think, it does leap across that. It goes into the private sector, and that's what we need to be looking at. It's the persuading those businesses, and again, a good example is COP26. The big issue is the private sector. It's not about governments, it's not about the public sector making them comply. In order to get the private sector paying the real living wage for it to become mainstream, and we're talking about not just individuals being better off, but it's about the whole community. And so I do think we need to straddle that, and the living wage does, and that's why we're talking about a living wage place, really important. And to highlight that, I mean, we're talking about Norwich, the people that live and work in Norwich are on a lower, and generally speaking, on average, on a lower salary than those who live outside the city, but they come into the city to work. And these are the ones making the decisions, on the ones who are already living in the city and on the lower salaries. So it's about establishing Norwich as a living wage place. It's really important. The report and the work that's being done is fantastic. People pulling together to help one another with food banks, the whole shaboodle. But quite frankly, we shouldn't have them. I've been in welfare rights for 20 odd years, and the rise of food banks is not progress. It's not an improvement. It's absolutely appalling. And the fact that Tesco's or any large supermarket can donate food that they can't manage to sell, that's not a plus. It might make them feel good, but it's not right. And quite frankly, the report's good, but we've still got a lot to do, and it's follow the money. The money is in the private sector, and that's why we're looking at the living wage. Just want to highlight that. It's not that they've done nothing wrong, we need to do more with the private sector. That's where the money is, and there's no shortage of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thomas. Powerful point, well made there. I don't think. Oh yeah, Ramona.
Well, I was just going to say, absolutely, we do completely agree. We need to work with the private sector, and I think the Good Economy Commission and the City Vision Partnership and some of the other strong relationships that we're working on within the city is part of that, as well as the living wage group. So we completely agree. We need to work with the private sector, and we need to get all the big institutions and the small institutions. We need to get people pulling in the right direction. So that's absolutely part of our work.
Thank you. Can I bring in Kate as well, please?
I just wanted to add on that, where we're putting our money where our mouth is, a part of the CRF bid that we've just been successful in. Some of that money is working with business in the community to specifically target businesses and understand how they can contribute to wider inequalities. So the person who is in post at the ITC, through the CRF, we can co-fund that post. And a huge amount of what she'll be doing is getting businesses to understand the issues in the areas that we're working, and trying, and she's very good at it, coaxing out from them what they can put into the pot that isn't just a handout, that isn't just leftovers, but is genuinely going to make a difference. So that's very much baked into the kind of hope that we've got going forward, that this is a whole systems approach, and that system includes shops, big business, whoever it is in that community. They're part of the community, and we've got to bring them into it.
Thank you for that. I think Councillor Driver was next.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think what Dawn had said is work with private companies is one of the best suggestions we're ahead today. But I think some of these private companies are just taking a mickey, really. I mean, they're buying more stuff in which they actually want, and it's easy to get rid of it. They give it to food banks instead of have to pay mega money, because otherwise they would have to put it into landfill. So we're actually saving these companies money in the long run. So they're not being generous by giving it to us. We're being generous by taking it off them and saving them money, which they don't pay to their workers. But I just want to move on a bit more on these maps. Now, I've been a councillor for 20 years now, I believe, or nearly 20 years, whatever it is. And I've seen these maps before, and it seemed like the red areas around the city, where they were, and nothing's really happened in the 20 years I've been a councillor, which I find is a great shame. Or would it spread a lot more, and I've done a hell of a lot? And the whole city would have been red. I'm always proud of that little red dot in the middle of Norfolk. Unusual, that. But is there any work done? I mean, you look at these maps, and you talk about people not having enough food for 40 hours. You talk about people in debt. Is there any work done about when people become unemployed and they get their week's wages or their month's wages, and then they've got to wait 6 or 7 weeks for their benefits to come in, and that puts them into poverty, and then they need to fill bank because they ain't got nothing to feed their kids for the weeks when they're not working and the benefit system paying in. Is there any work that the council have done to find out how much this is done, and also about pay? You know, when I first left school and went to the hospital or butcher shop, I got paid weekly. And that was cash as well. I mean, I'd rather have cash than I did a bank account. I had a bank account for donkey's years, but if I got paid weekly, I knew what I was spending each week. And then suddenly it just changed to a monthly. Well, I mean, I got this money. Suddenly, after 3 weeks, I've gone and left. Where did it go? What do you expect it? Because there's just there. You're just spending the money. Now, have we ever looked about, let's go back to paying weekly? Would that make a big difference? Would it, you know, when people become unemployed and stuff, would it be better to keep paying them until their benefits appear? I mean, had the council done any work into equalities like that, or should we be looking that way?
Thank you, Councillor Driver. And by the way, I'm sure something has happened in the 20 years that you've been a councillor. Thank you, Vicky.
Our hands are obviously quite tied at the moment around UC legislation, but what we've tried to do is, in terms of things like our CTRS policy, as you know, we've tried to mitigate the impact of some of the UC legislation where we can. We've done an awful lot of work just recently around debt and early intervention, so trying to get people to the support they need as quickly as we can. So as soon as we identify that someone needs support, then we will put income referrals in place. We've done a lot of work around supporting vulnerable people. So we now have in place the standard financial statement so that we can work holistically to give residents the support that they need rather than bouncing across different services. We have weekly, what we term vulnerability meetings, which means that multiple service areas come together to discuss people that we feel might need additional support, to work out what solutions might be out there. Not everything sits within our control, so we need to have a really good understanding of what other support networks are available across the city. We have the fantastic NCAM referral system, which means that we can get people just to the support that they need as early as possible. We're doing some work right now to ensure that the second someone calls us because they've had a notice for council tax, we ask them at that initial point of contact, can we get you some support to help you with this? And then we will use that as a referral. So there's lots and lots of things that have changed this year to try to get people to the support they need as early as possible. It's no quick fix. We're well aware of the fact that there's not enough money out there, people aren't earning enough, the living wage work has come some way. I've just had a quick look at some of the stats, and actually of the 16 accredited employers for 2021, interestingly, I think 9 of those overall were private sector. Yeah. So, we are starting to make inroads in places where it matters. We're learning from other cities that have been through the living wage cities process to understand how they've reached success. Cardiff was a really, really interesting city. You get on a train when you go into Cardiff and actually they're all paid, they're accredited, it's a living wage. You go to the hospital, it's run by people that are receiving the living wage. It's really, really interesting stuff. We have a really, really energetic group, action group, and we're putting together what we hope will be a really robust plan for the next 3 years. And the best way out of poverty is to ensure that people receive enough money to live on, and that's the key. But meanwhile, we need to get people the support they can as quickly as we can, so early intervention is key for that.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Osborne, you're next, please.
Thanks. Just as a sort of general point on that, what Councillor Thomas raised about companies, I understand what you're saying, Vaughan and Keith as well. I do also slightly want to make sure that argument doesn't turn into we should let companies do what, it's all companies' responsibility, because that is kind of what came out of COP, actually, you raised that example, and the sort of Chancellor saying companies have to take this on, and actually governments need to legislate, which places what Adam was saying earlier, but that's kind of a more general point. I just want to pick up on what Ramona said earlier about citizen participation, and I'd just be interested to know what the council's vision for that is, and what we're hoping to achieve, how is that going to work. I sort of implied earlier that maybe residents could be on the stakeholder, the steering group. I don't actually think that would necessarily be the best thing to do, because tenants have busy lives and can't always expect people to do work for free. But how are we going to involve tenants particularly, people, or tenants and leaseholders, I guess, in the council's work on reducing inequalities? And we're looking at things like participatory budgeting, and how we're getting them to involve in actual decision making. That is a way to get people involved. Shall I ask my other questions? I've got two other questions, if that's all right. The other question is about health inequalities. So so you mentioned food poverty and fuel poverty and other forms of inequality, but health isn't mentioned in the report, and it's not blamed. I'm just wondering where that sits within this and what work's being done to look at health inequalities, including looking at environmental determinants of health, air pollution, housing. And the other one is actually, Alan's gone now, but he mentioned at the start COP26 and the need for a green transition. And at the last Scrutiny meeting, I talked about the economic strategy and the need for that to focus on a green transition as well. And just, obviously Alan's gone, but I'm wondering if officers can answer, what are we actually envisaging for a green transition for Norwich? Has there been an analysis done on the impact of that for social inclusion? For example, there's been quite a few studies on how many jobs could be created in renewable energy and retrofit. And we've done any work on looking at what that would actually mean for getting money into the region, who would benefit from that, and comparing so that people who wouldn't maybe necessarily be able to access those jobs normally are able to get into those jobs.
Thank you for those questions, and thank you, Kate.
I'm going to take the first two. I'm afraid the third one is not quite my skill set. So in terms of the citizen participation vision, I think I might have just, I haven't left my slides. So where we're at the moment, we've done a lot of research, a lot of learning, understanding some key principles and methodologies that we think are the right sort of ones. That's been done working with internal teams about how they currently do things and what's working, what's not, what can we improve. We've done engagement with community groups on what their expectations of us are and what good would look like to them. Other councils, other organisations where they're doing really well with this, so making sure we're learning from lots of different places. And actually, we've been, even just the work we've done to date has been featured quite a lot in some quite cool global think tank stuff, which has been amazing, given that we're on quite a tight budget. And then we've learned from existing projects that we've done, or others that have done, that have had really good outcomes that we can try and understand why it was and learn from. So phase one was all about research, understanding, good practice. And then we're kind of in phase two now, where we've got some of those principles we think are the right principles. And now what we need to do is do some action against them to see if those are the right principles. That if we bake them into what we're doing, do we see an improvement? Do we see a difference? So the kind of key principles we were looking at, which is on the other side, are that we already do have some really good practice around how we engage with people. So we've got to respect that, really amplify that, and make sure that that's shown where it's being done really well. What has been quite clear is that a lot of the other councils who are held up as exemplars are received an awful lot of external funding and had an awful lot of time, which I think is always the key thing with really significant culture changes. It does take time, but that doesn't mean that we're not still going to have lofty ambitions. A lot of it is about how we invite our residents to talk to us. A huge part of it is when someone gets an email, when someone gets a request to say the council would really like to hear from you, the answer is often, and so what? What's in it for me? As you said, busy lives, lots of other priorities. We need to better understand how we understand those people enough that when we say we would really like your opinion, we're genuinely going to change something as a result of them actively participating, and we let them know that. Understanding how best to make them feel that that opportunity is there for them and they're not excluded from it. Some residents will engage us sometimes, some residents will engage not so much, but so long as we have the opportunities open there when they want to and have the capacity, we need to make sure we respect that and can't just force it on them. There's some excellent tools on offer, one of which we're piloting at the moment, which we're soft launching as a bit of a pilot alongside the biodiversity engagement, which is by a company called Bang the Table. I will stress, because it is an online tool, it's not our only tool, we're doing loads of offline stuff as well, because we're very acutely aware of digital exclusion. But it's an incredible tool that allows us to put projects up and just invite ideas, invite people to put up images, tell us where they've seen amazing practice before, talk to each other in forums, have small polls, have surveys, and we can really build quite a world around that and get some incredible analytics from it as well, so that we can look at, are we hitting the people we actually want to? Are these the people who would normally engage with us? Are we, in using this platform, seeing new voices coming into the mix? So looking at our own internal services and making sure that wherever possible we can build in that opportunity for citizen involvement and co-production, and how do we support our colleagues who maybe that isn't their bread and butter? How are we supporting them to actually manage that? Looking at how we kind of shift our culture a little bit, rather than to what service can we deliver at you that's going to make you go away, to how can we empower you to look at that problem yourself and really try and default to some of those community-led answers to the questions, which are often almost like they're latent in the community. We just need to have the skills to be able to bring them out. And acknowledging that actually in those RETA-type areas we want to work in, that does take time, and it is complex, and it is about getting to know our residents really, really well, so we build around them as opposed to imposing something we've already decided on top of them. So that's kind of where we're at, and then we've been piloting that in a number of different ways. So for those of you familiar with the work we're trying in Mile Cross at the moment, we've got kind of pop-up shops, and we're working with locally embedded organisations to sort of understand different routes into talking to people. We've been lucky enough to have some of the Good Economy Commission funding to look at unheard voices. We've been exploring the concepts around gamification as a way to kind of engage people who perhaps don't normally engage with us, and very specifically targeting core cohorts within that. We did a bit of work with the opportunity area, which is around young people's social mobility, around how we change up some of our grant processes to make them more inclusive for people. So that we have loads of really amazing grassroots groups who might look at a really complicated application form and go, oh, not for me. So that area misses out on that funding because of the way we've structured our grants. So we want to try and bleed that and say, how do we do it better? So we've redesigned that around a theory of change model. We're looking at our green space permissions. Sorry, this is going to get really long and boring, I'm so sorry. How we make sure that people feel they can access the green space that we have more effectively, minimising officer time, maximising the amount of time the community can work on them. Obviously, all of this really early doors was put straight in with all of our RETA work into the Community Renewal Fund bid. And I really think that's why we were successful, because it was very well thought out over a number of years with a huge amount of evidence behind it, that we were able to take that, transpose it and say, here's what's going to help, give us some money. We're currently piloting a community connector role with pop-up enterprises, which is based on quite well evidenced from other places, including Great Yarmouth's Neighbourhoods That Work programme, which is about employing people from the local area on a living wage. I can say it because Alan's gone, the fact that living wage has gone up has caused me a nightmare in budgets, but it's really important to us that we pay the living wage and we get people from those communities. And I was really thrilled because the first round of recruitment has just finished and we just appointed the first 4. And we got 8 applications from people in Mile Cross, which we were kind of honestly shocked by. It was really amazing to have done a really brilliant campaign through the guys at the Shoebox Community Hub to say to people, what we value is the fact you live here and you know your patch and we want to work with you. and we've got some incredible candidates to start piloting that work. So yeah, before I go on too much and work out if I've actually answered your question, so that is our vision, is to get really, really good, not just at one-off consultation, but that constant listening, acting on feedback from people, because if we're not giving them back what changes that they've made, they're not going to keep interacting with us. So it's that kind of holistic loop that we're going for. And I'm very aware in terms of tenants, I've been working with Sarah loads on how the work that we're doing then can support with the white paper around that social inclusion and that engagement with tenants, because if we're doing something good for everyone, we might as well use that same learning with the tenants as well. So they're very much at the forefront of our minds. Hopefully that's answered that question. And then in health inequalities... yes.
Just kind of, is it right if I come back on that first? Before moving on to health. Yeah, thank you for that. That does more or less answer the question. Just a couple of sort of follow-ups on that. Firstly, we as councillors see some of that work, because it's the first time I've heard about a lot of that. It'd be really good just to see some of that. We speak to people who are drawn up weekly, so we actually could maybe able to feed some of that in and help people to get involved. So yeah, it'd be really good for us to see that. The other, you mentioned, when people get a letter from the council, they maybe think, what's in it for me? I don't know if it's necessarily people thinking what's in it for me. It's more a question of what's actually going to happen if they respond. And this is something that we've raised in a number of channels, and Lou will be aware of this. It certainly sometimes feels like residents report things, and this is sort of wider. This is not just about social inclusion, but they may report something that's wrong in their estate, and it feels like they don't get anything back, and they don't hear back like a satisfactory response, particularly on antisocial behaviour, and that then impacts on residents' trust in the council, and they feel like people aren't listening to them. Not saying that that's the case, but that's how it feels. I think there's just a wider look at, how does the council communicate with residents? I could go into a specific example around Barnard's Yard, but I might pick that up offline, and I might catch you after this, actually. We'll talk about that. Yeah, but there's just, and that's, it's not just your gate, but it's a wider thing around the council. How does the council communicate with residents?
So just to pick up on the what's in it for me, it's more what change are we going to see? So it's very rarely usually a personal thing. It's what benefit am I going to be bringing to the wider community, and what change are we going to see for that? In terms of the council updates, we are trying to build in, especially with, I think you've seen the Green Spaces Commission's trying to build in, making sure councillors are aware of new things that are coming up in their area and kept informed through that. And the next stage of this participation work will involve coming out to councillors and going, I feel like we've learned this so far. How does this chime with what you're seeing in your patches as well? And sorry, remind me of the second bit of that question. Is there something I've missed there?
Communication as well.
Yeah, so that's where we get to our phase 3 of our community, citizen participation, is looking at all of those opportunities across the council. Because, like you say, we're the community enabling team, but that doesn't mean anyone else is prohibited from enabling a member of the community. So what we want to do is we've created a kind of draft workbook, more like a blueprint than a strategy as such, but just trying to explain what those principles are to people, understand what they need from us in terms of training, developing some training and workshops for internal officers. So if it isn't their natural skill set, they might just see something in there and go, actually, I feel like I might be able to build this into what I'm doing, but I need a little bit of support. So getting them to kind of come to us and use us as a resource to help them build that into their service delivery, as much as it is just our team, because it does have to be a whole council approach or it won't work.
Thank you for that. Councillor Maxwell next, please.
So just on the help
Thank you. Not Lord Mayor. But very interested to hear what you've been saying, and also very interested to see that there is talk of a community supermarket. About 8 years ago, we went up to South Yorkshire to see one in existence, and it was working really, really wonderfully well. Two things I came away with from that is that people are worried about taking something free. So what they did actually make them pay for this, but it was very, very, very cheap. But they also found that a lot of people couldn't read and write. And so they got together and they put together a sort of a formula for them to get into reading and writing, learning to read, by showing them what the prices were. And it evolved into having a space where people could go and learn to read and write properly, and also basic mathematics. And it was working wonderfully well. And I think this is the sort of thing that we should be encouraging. We do still have people who can't read. And I don't think that we take into account that what we could do to help. You see them come into the food bank that I help at, and a lot of them bring their children in, so they could say and literally interpret in English for us. And I think that's something that's sadly lacking at the moment, but we're aware of it, and I think that this is going some way to get them to come forward so we can help them. So I'm very pleased with this, thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious that we are now an hour and a half into the meeting and we're still on questions. We need to think about getting to the point of coming up with some recommendations. I've so far seen hands for more questions from Vaughan Thomas, Councillors Giles, Galvin and Osborne. And I think... You are next on my list, Councillor.
So I just want to propose a 5-minute adjournment. I'm just mindful that there's a rumour going around City Hall that if you pop out for 5 minutes, you won't be allowed to vote. And at the risk of you talking about me when I'm not here, I'd like to propose a 5-minute adjournment.
I'm happy to have a comfort break for members. So is everybody in agreement with that? Yeah, 5 minutes.
When we come back from that, are we going to move to recommendations?
Well, I've still got a few more people indicating questions at that point, and then we will hopefully quite rapidly get to recommendations.
For information, I'm happy to take my questions offline.
Thank you. So we'll be back at just after 6:05. Thank you. welcome back after our short interlude. Councillor Giles, I think you were next up with a question, please.
I was going to ask about the social supermarket as well, so I don't think Councillor Maxwell, I don't think that was answered, so if we can move on to that, that'd be great. Thank you.
I apologise, but what was the question within that?
I suppose the question is, what a social supermarket entails and what value it would bring, because, there is that, there shouldn't be, but there is that shame factor about going to food banks for some people.
I think so the way we sort of effectively tried to catalyse a social supermarket is it came up as part of the Food Poverty Action Plan that the voluntary sector partners that we had put together, and they had identified in a similar fashion to us that actually that would be a really, really useful thing. A little bit of arm bending in housing, and we found a lovely cafe that was perfect on Hall Road, which they had offered for rent-free to allow it to actually start and become sustainable. So we did a kind of almost a community asset transfer type model, so that we were being very inclusive to the types of organisations that might want to put something forward, to the types of models they might be looking at. And the feed was successful within that, and the business plan they've got, very much like you say, it's about creating a place that everybody goes to so that there's no stigma. You might be going there because you're visiting the cafe and you're paying full price at the cafe. You might be going in there because you're getting subsidised fruit and veg from the supermarket. It's wholly designed to be like any other one of the feeds projects, where it's just everyone welcome and whatever you're here for is fine. So the business plan they builds in that model, as you said, Marion, about how we make sure people are paying a small amount for their food, but it may be, and we're working with the other voluntary sector partners to really decide on what the exact model looks like. It may be a tiered model, it may be a one-size-fits-all model, but we're currently working at that. But the idea is that you pay a small amount of money for a shopping bag full of food. So you're much better off than you were going to the supermarket. It does utilise waste and donated food, but also food from producers who are happy to give not stuff that's going out of date. Within the social supermarket, the feed put forward is we've linked it to a kind of community cafe, community hub model as well. So there will be a cafe within there that will be open to everybody, like the rest of the feeds cafes, really good food. So anyone will be able to come in and utilise that, and that will help subsidise the rest of the social supermarket for those who need it. And they're also planning, very much linked to what was being said about literacy there, about looking at the holistic needs of people who are coming. So looking at, do they need a referral to NCAM? Is there something we can support around their housing needs? And obviously, because the feeding part pathways, that can be quite heavily linked into what they know already about that existing sector support that is there. But we also want to make it a social supermarket. So very much about inviting people in after hours in the cafe, using it to run workshops, training sessions. They've got plans to do cooking courses and also give away kind of cooking starter packs for people who are coming along. Working with the people from the boards team to look at sort of different ethnic evenings for different food, because food brings everyone together. Celebrating that different types of cuisine. So all sorts of different things they've got in that business model, which is very much why we chose theirs, because it was really holistic in that support for people feeling more connected as well as accessing food. So we're hopeful it'll be a really successful model.
Thank you for that. I'd like to prioritise any members who haven't asked a question yet. So Councillor Stutely, I see your hand is up, so that's ideally well timed.
Thank you, and thank you for the report and that previous answer. My question was going to also be on the community supermarket. So just as a follow-up to that, have we got a timetable for opening, and also have we got the funding in place for the staff member to manage that project?
So the timescale as it stands at the moment is we're just agreeing a licence to occupy for the feed, because the leases have taken quite a long time and they need to get in and get some work done with their contractors. So they should be able to get the contractors in over this month, December, and hopefully not into too much of January. And Lucy's idea is still to open in the first couple of months of the new year, if possible. The staff member is already in place, and to work that, the funding for the capital works actually came through the Neighbourhood's Community Infrastructure Levy. So they were able to use the link to the fact that it's going to be a new service and it's dedicated to growth to kind of evidence a neighbourhood SIL application. So that's all fully funded, and then they have gone and got the external funding for the staff members to work at the cafe. But that has been successful, and they have already appointed, so she's ready and raring to go.
Thank you very much for that.
Can I just ask, would we look to shut down other film banks in the city to use a bigger place?
There's no plans to shut down any food banks. The next food poverty meeting is actually about how can we almost start to not need food banks. That's the ideal, isn't it? Nobody wants there to be food banks. That means something's gone wrong. So it's looking at how we can help impart through that food poverty action plan best practice and alternatives to actually minimise the need for those food banks. I don't think we'd ever want to look at consolidating them in one place, just because what we certainly found through COVID was the proximity of people to them was really important. Not having to get a bus, not having to travel too far. So actually them being quite small and localised is really beneficial. So we wouldn't look to consolidate them, but in the long term what we'd love is in the nicest possible way they won't be.
Thank you. There's an interesting juxtaposition I found between high demand for use of food banks, and obviously that's a position no one wants to see. But at the same time, there clearly must be an awful amount of generosity out there, because there's so much food in the food banks that they're in effect turning away donations of more food because there's just too much there. And the suggestion is that actually they'd rather have money at the moment, so that can be used to give people the sorts of emergency vouchers for fuel and such like that they can't access via the food bank. Thank you. Councillor Galvin, I think you were next, please.
Thank you. I kind of think we can start moving towards recommendations unless other people have other questions, but mine was more around a recommendation. We don't have a cabinet member here or anyone political now to answer questions, really, do we either? So I have got other questions I'd very much like to ask that are more about the general trends of inequality in the city and less about initiatives. But I guess I can pick them up elsewhere. And that really is the basis of my idea, which picks up on what Keith said about a recommendation that, and it was something we asked in our questions, could we have a sort of evidence-based background report on inequalities in Norwich with comparative benchmark figures from other places and long-term trends that would pick up as well people-based working as well as locality-based, because I'm very painfully aware that a lot of the most people that suffer the most with inequalities are, for example, people from other countries, transient populations, homeless people that are actually, not lucky enough to be in a locality a lot of the time. So a lot of the work we've talked about here is based around communities, and that's all very interesting. But actually, the bigger picture. So could we have a recommendation around having an evidence-based framework that will actually, again, it's something for officers to pick up, I think, a framework that will set some KPIs and link into the KPIs that are being worked on in the corporate plan, and ask Cabinet to specifically address that long-term framework. And as part of that framework, can we look at efficacy of response? So, we're actually assessing whether things work or not in terms of policy. So initiatives are actually measured against a benchmark of whether they work. This is a really thorny, difficult problem, inequality, and it's a society-wide problem. So, I think we need to take a really robust, evidence-based approach that stretches back in time and looks forward, so that when we get a report like this, it's got a section at the beginning that kind of we can measure ourselves against as a council. Can you get a recommendation out of that?
Just looking for something that's succinct for the...
Okay,
I mean, having an evidence-based framework that sets, with a set of KPIs seems to encapsulate quite a lot of that.
And linked to the corporate plan, but it would, so it would be evidence-based on inequalities in Norwich, including benchmark figures with other similar cities and long-term trends. So critically, the long-term trends.
Lucy has noted down a background report on equality in Norwich with benchmarking from other cities and long-term trends to inform an evidence-based framework which sets KPIs and links to existing KPIs.
Would anyone like to add to that or amend it? I'm trying to address what Keith raised, is like, is it got better? I think it's a really, really important question.
Councillor Driver and then Councillor Fulton McAllister.
I was going to recommend something else. Okay.
Well, we'll deal with just fine tuning this particular recommendation. Does anyone have anything they want to say on this particular one?
Just Lucy, equalities is a very broad.
Sorry, Councillor Fulton McAllister, could you use your microphone, please?
Sorry. So equalities is a very broad area. Did you mean all equality strands, or did you mean more specific to income inequality, etc.? Just for clarity more than anything else.
I'd like to look at other inequalities as well as
Okay. Does anyone else have any comments on that particular recommendation? Councillor Driver.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion, but I don't want to take away someone who's doing a really good job at the moment and what they're actually done and what they're actually planned is. I wouldn't mind having comparisons made by other towns, like someone like Exeter or Bristol or something like that. Just some comparisons with the same kind of town that we are, but put more resources into KPIs and work this out.
I mean, I think
change. I just think we would take someone away who's doing good in the community now to work on something which we wouldn't get anything out of.
I mean, I think the only point I will make is, my understanding is that the people who would be producing the report on KPIs are not necessarily those ones who are not those ones who are working in the community. So I think we need to draw a distinction between those colleagues here who look at data and those who are out doing a particular role in the community. So I don't think this suggestion from Councillor Galvin will diminish the work that is being done in the community.
Could I address that by just adding to the recommendation and not to the detriment of on the ground work?
Any other comments on that one? We'll go through all these all in look at them in minutes. But who has other recommendations? Councillor Fulton McAllister.
Well, how am I going to word this recommendation? This is because of some of the legal difficulties that Leah and I spoke about during the break. So I'd like to recommend that Cabinet consider whether it is legally viable to begin establishing a matrix which accords with our procurement strategy, including not just the living wage as a requirement for us to contract to organisations, but also trade union recognition, the use of or lack of use of exploitative 0 hours contracts, and having a gender pay gap broadly comparable with the City Council. I think that should probably be separated into A, B and C. That would be the first recommendation. The second recommendation I was going to make was actually similar to Councillor Galvin, so I'm happy for hers to stand and take precedence over that.
Okay, thank you for that. As with all of these, probably within the confines of this meeting. We can't get an exact word for word, but the broad thrust of the suggestion and the recommendation will then be taken away and looked at. Who was next? Councillor Driver, then Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, I like the recommendation to Cabinet that we carry on with the good work which these members have done in the community as this report is put out. But I'd also like to bring it back to scrutiny at some time when they've done more work into the other 5 boards they've got to move into, and to tell us just a bit more what's happening in those wards. Like, how many people do you think you actually helped? Is there any figure there, like 200 in Lakenham or 100 or 50? I mean, how many lives do you think you changed? That's the kind of information I would like to see and brought back at some time. So I also recommend the Cabinet that they put the resources in there to do this. I think this is one of the main things in the city that we should be concentrating on. Food poverty, fuel poverty. We're talking about we've got some money in there for fuel poverty. I've bet that all this winter, there's no doubt about that. With the prices of gas and electricity going up sky high, people are going to be crying out for help in fuel poverty. I mean, so we've really got to look into why, well, we know roughly why this is here, because because we've got money from the government, but we need to keep doing this kind of work. So I'd like to recommend that we tell Cabinet to put the resources in there to carry on with the good work they've already achieved, and to come back with a report to scrutiny in 9 months' time, or roughly that time, whatever they think would be the right idea to come back in.
Would you like a report to scrutiny, or do you think?
To scrutiny, or to full members.
Member briefing.
A member briefing. A lot of members turn up with your scrutiny. You got us here. Member briefing, you might only get half on us.
Really?
So I'm a bit one way or the other on that.
Thank you, Chair. It's specifically on this recommendation. I think that it would be good to review this in scrutiny again, perhaps this time next year or whenever makes sense, so that we can actually look at a ward by ward breakdown of what those projects have delivered. Because the really important thing is the delivery of this project. Yeah. There's no point pumping money into it if it's not working. And I'm actually incredibly excited about what we have heard about. And it would be really good to hear about the successes, and perhaps to hear from some of the people that we have helped, what they think worked and what didn't.
Okay. Full agreement on that approach? Yeah, great, thank you. Councillor Osborne, you are next, please.
Yes, slightly changing the recommendations. I mentioned earlier, obviously, there's a wider piece on how the council communicates, and this is actually something that I think was looked at when I think it might have been rough sleeping, or we discussed this before, is looking at reviewing how the council writes its letters to tenants and residents, and this is sort of, I guess, a wider piece about how does the council communicate with tenants, because obviously if people are in need of support for whatever reason, in some cases people don't know who to contact, and appreciate the work that Kate's doing and trying to sort of engage tenants and residents through initiatives, but often people will, their primary concerns will be housing or debt advice, and I think then getting letters from the council that are maybe not very excessively worded, or that they feel like they're just being told stuff, instead of having things imposed on them rather than actually having a voice themselves, is maybe not helpful in some cases. So there's just I'm sort of looking to officers as to whether that's feasible to review the council's communication with tenants overall. I think that's really important.
I mean, it's an interesting point, because I recall that when it had come to scrutiny before, there was some in essence, the council's hands were tied over some aspects of the way the communication took the form of letters took place because of legal requirements set out about how, if you're writing someone about tenancies or rent matters or so on and so forth, you have to put certain paragraphs in that are set out, which are often not inviting, they're not engaging. Can anyone pick up Councillor Osborne's points about how that might turn into a potential recommendation? Lou, I don't know if that's something you could.
It's very wide and it's a really large piece of work. So I think that, you know, we have an awareness as officers that there is some work to do around the kind of style of communication with tenants, particularly. You know, so there is a kind of ongoing change to the way we do that. We're at the beginning of that journey. I'm not quite sure that, I mean, it's really broad in scope.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. I mean, if it's helpful, I can feed in some examples of what I think, examples where I've come across it being a problem. And that's about not just the sort of style of communication, but also the timing and what's expected and, you know, who's available for people to contact and so on. If it's helpful, keep that in.
Are you suggesting that this is an ongoing piece of work anyway? So I wondered whether the recommendation can be to receive an update on what works that are being done in order to improve communication with tenants. So rather than perhaps initiating some additional work, actually we can be updated as a committee on work that's currently underway, and that can then help inform our further deliberations. Councillor Driver.
Yeah, can I just come into that? I mean, we had a problem area in Lakenham once in a certain road, and what community actually got, we actually put councillors, the police, social services, housing, and everyone, we all knocked on doors at the same time. And we all worked together, and we found that the people who wanted the help, they had a social worker, but they had two more. And social workers didn't know, another social worker was dealing with it, and this was all waste of money and stuff like that. And in the end, the tenants were getting better help by streamlining down to just one social worker and stuff like that. But that was only found out because we'd all knocked on the door. Some had housing problems, some had money problems, some had getting the food, you know, or antisocial behaviour. I mean, you had all the different departments there at the same time. I don't know, council officers, we should take that forward and do that again sometime, but that worked, and that's sort of the whole antisocial behaviour and area out completely.
Thank you for that. Councillor Osborne.
Yeah, just echoing what I was saying. I was talking to officers about restarting the estates audits, which I think is a really good way of actually engaging tenants. I know that is going to be happening, I think, certainly in Mancroft in the next couple of weeks.
So I'm just wondering where we can get to. And I think there is something that is achievable in that. And I take on board Lou's point about not wanting to create a massive amount of work.
Can I talk to Louise about that, and then we can have an update?
Yeah. I mean, it won't then be a recommendation for today.
I guess maybe it's just a note that at some point we'll get an update on.
Yeah. I mean, if we can have a recommendation. We'll receive an update on the council's work around communication with tenants and keep it fairly high level like that. Anything else from members at this stage? Councillor Stupey and then Councillor Galvin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. We've talked about the community supermarkets, and I think we're probably all in agreement that it's going to be, when introduced, it's going to be a great help to people in the area where we've chosen. So I guess a recommendation would be to resource staffing for seeking new venues across the city where they're needed for such provision. and also for increasing provision. I know that that's also a future project for which time and funding is required, and if that hasn't already been committed, a recommendation to commit to the time and funding for an extension of these projects.
I think there is we're in fact asking Cabinet to consider looking at the resourcing for that, in essence. Councillor Giles, do you have a comment on that one?
Yeah, just whether we want to evaluate first how the first one works before rolling it out elsewhere across the city.
I think perhaps the work to seek new venues needn't be held up by waiting to see how it operates, because there are case studies elsewhere that, and Councillor Maxwell alluded to one where we are expecting good results from this, so the sooner we can roll it out further, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Do we have agreement with that as an approach to a recommendation? Thank you. We'll take on board what you've said. No doubt one of my officer colleagues has noted that down. There'll be some wording that encapsulates that.
Thank you. Actually, further to what Councillor Giles said, I am very interested to see how it will work and how many people we will be able to help through that particular supermarket. So the data is always important.
It's next door to our office, I'm sure we can make good use of the cafe.
I was wondering where it was. I wondered if it was the former Pat's Cafe. Yeah. Aging myself there. Councillor Galvin.
Thank you. It was mentioned, but just to make sure it gets picked up, to engage with communities to implement participatory budgeting approaches.
Any comments on engaging with communities around participatory budgeting? Happy with that too? Yeah. Great, thank you. Councillor Stewart.
Well, just one more, because we didn't talk at great length about digital inclusion. And again, really to recommend to Cabinet that that work is continued and extended where possible, so to include many households and areas such as those we've identified, because access to full digital inclusion will help with all elements of this project.
Yeah, happy to support that. In fact, digital inclusion is one of the things that came up at Cabinet yesterday evening in one of the reports looking at emergency SIM cards that have been given out, so that those that didn't have access to vital data had access to it. So yes, I'm very happy to see digital inclusion come to recommendation. Councillor Driver?
It sounds to me that one time they were talking about putting things on the lamp posts for free Wi-Fi for every resident in Norwich. Did that ever happen? Is that there or?
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I keep seeing things on lamp posts, so I don't know what they are.
There's Wi-Fi in the city centre.
Okay, but they thought they were doing it around the estates at one time, didn't they? They did do it.
Councillor Galvin.
I don't know whether we can introduce this as a recommendation, but a really key element of inequality in Norwich, a place where it falls down shockingly low, is education, skills and training nationally. So we're number 3 and we're right down the bottom. So whether we could bring it back to another scrutiny to look at how Norwich, it's not really, we mention in the report apprenticeships, but I think education and skills in the city and how we build the base of that is also, as well as the living wage, that's what helps to lift people out of unequal situations. So can we find a way of picking that up today in a recommendation?
Councillor Giles.
Yes, it's obviously a big issue. I'm just thinking in terms of the topic matrix. Obviously, we don't have control and much power over education and skills in the city. or very little anyway, and I'm just thinking how much can we influence on that topic? It's obviously primarily a county council matter.
Yeah, it's an interesting and complex one, because obviously the education is county council, apart from those that are directly funded by the DFE. But I wonder if there's a link, particularly when we're talking about apprenticeships, through our function that we have around economic development, and whether it does link back into the council that way. So I'm just mulling that over at the moment. I'll bring in Councillor Fulton McAllister while I...
So we have previously scrutinised things like the closure of Shore Start, which is primarily a county council function. And I think that actually, if we're scrutinising the impact that it has on our residents, and how we as a city council can improve their situation, and it might be through things like, I know that we have leases taken out by a number of educational providers on Norwich City Council properties. For example, St Ed's has a lease with Norwich City Council, and it might be through what additional partnership working we can do with those organisations that we're trying to frame it around. But I certainly think it's a good area that we do need to focus on, because we're shamefully low down in multiple regards when it comes to education and skills.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point for some of these where we're looking at perhaps bigger pieces of work, which I think this one is. I think this is, for the reasons that have been highlighted, a very valuable thing to do. But realistically, we're not going to fit it into this civic year. I'm just trying to work out what the mechanism for then getting that fed into the processes.
Could we note it as a note, well, note it in our recommendations that it's a big part of the picture of inequality, and that we want to look at it in the future, just so that we show we recognise it.
And members recognise the link between inequalities and education provision, and we can find some words around that, which I think is getting broad nods from the members. Councillor Osborne, and then we probably ought to just wrapping this up.
I think that Matthew's point is a very good one. About how we work with partners. I wonder if we can actually look at who we can get into Scrutiny to look at that. Whether we can get the local enterprise partnership you mentioned, Tenants. Sure Lorraine Bliss from Tenants would be happy to speak to this committee. Matt, other people with skills.
Okay. I think if there's nothing else, I'm going to draw a line under item 6 now. Thank you very much. We've got some recommendations. I'll go away and work with officers and fine-tune the wording. We also have the advantage of having the recording to go back and make sure that the sentiments of the committee are accurately reflected. So we're now moving on to item 7, which is the work programme, and that is on page 43 of your papers. So a couple of points that I need to make. I hope I get these correct, because there are a number of them. Thanks so much to those officers who helped us out with item 6. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, on December the 2nd, we have an extra meeting in the diary for looking at the business plans for NCSL and NRL. That meeting will now not go ahead, as the business plans won't be fully ready for scrutiny at that point. So the expectation is we would have that on something like the 10th or the 11th of January, the date to be confirmed, and we can do that as an online meeting because it won't technically be taking any decisions, which hopefully will make it easier for members to access. On December the 16th, we should be looking at the corporate plan, but as we're looking at, there's going to be a more detailed development of the corporate plan this year rather than just a refresh. That will then have to come to us in January. Therefore, the item that we would have looked at in January, which is sustainable, inclusive merged economy, I think that will go from to the March meeting. Rewinding slightly to December, we will then continue to hold that meeting, and we will look at the equality report, which we look at annually in December in some more detail, possibly picking up some HR elements that we're going to possibly going to cover the week before. So there's a few things that are being worked on, but there'll be plenty to scrutinise. Just things will be reordered a little bit. Yeah, did I get all of that? I think.
Yes, that's right, Chair. I think we've had a discussion earlier about the equality report released in December, and it's that, as you say, it's an HR element, so we're just looking at the timing of that. Unfortunately, I've just not been in the position where I can get an answer for you today, but I'm sure we'll be able to update you in the next day or two.
Thank you very much. So, let's open that up to questions and comment. Councillor Galvin.
Yeah, thank you. I submitted a topic form for scrutiny for the health and safety checks, which I was taken in. I'd like that to be made sure. I'd like to record that now, that I would like that to be in the minutes of the meeting. We talked about that in the pre-meeting, so just make that clear that I would like the one I submitted yesterday to be in. The scrutiny topic form that I submitted pre-scrutiny to Cabinet, a substantial amount of it hasn't been covered yet. I highlighted it on the form I submitted. So I'd like to ask that scrutiny looks at the health and safety compliance in council properties as per this topic form, including how the issue had managed to develop without being rectified, the process of contact monitoring, and how it affected the situation and any implications for other contracts. So that can be circulated if people would like to see it. I think we're at a crossroads with the public, and we urgently need, as a council, to look at the process of contract management, and scrutiny is the place to do that. It will have a good benefit for us as a council. It will show transparency. It will show that we take the situation seriously. I entirely accept that the situation is being dealt with to the best of our ability. But I think as a scrutiny committee, we need to actually look at what happened, what went wrong over the time, to make sure that there isn't anything else in our contract processes or procedures or policies that will lead to something like this again happening. It was a nasty shock, and we can do something with our time as a committee to make sure that we rectify that. So I'd like to again put that topic form through and ask that it's included on the work programme. It doesn't need to be immediately because we've just done the other scrutiny, so I don't want to take time from other things that are already agreed, but I'd like to see it in the programme.
Okay, I'll just pick up your first point around what's in the minutes. So the minute of the meeting of last Friday will reflect the fact that you submitted a topic form. So that will be in the public record that form was submitted for that meeting.
Just then I was referring to now today. So
I think that I will now pass over to the monitoring officer, because I don't believe that the form you resubmitted for the meeting today met the requirements of the Constitution in terms of its timeliness. So, but I'll pass over to Leah for that.
Yes, if members want a topic form to be considered at the scrutiny committee, they have to submit it to me or my team, and they'll pass it on to me within 10 working days of the meeting. So because we only received that yesterday, that's not sufficient time to place it on today's agenda.
It's the same form as I already submitted a couple of weeks ago, so it's already been submitted. It's the same form, I just put some highlighting on it, so you did have it much more than 10 days. So that's not a problem I would have thought. It's exactly the same.
But that item was considered as part of Friday's discussion, because you made some recommendations which I thought were substantively that topic for, which were then voted to not be taken forward.
Yeah, that I'm bringing it here to you today again because I don't think it was dealt with. We didn't deal with substantial parts of it, so I would like Scrutiny to look at that.
Good. Bring in Leo again, then Councillor Driver.
So that relates to the part of the Constitution which deals with previous decisions. So a motion that's similar in terms to or which has the same effect as one that has been rejected at a meeting of the Council, this applies to committees too, in the past 6 months cannot be moved unless it's signed by at least 10 members of the Council. Once it's dealt with, no councillor can propose a similar motion or amendment for 6 months. So the effect of the motion that you're talking about today substantively relates to the motion that you proposed, or the recommendation you proposed on Friday, which was to have a review of what happened in relation to the housing compliance matter. That motion was defeated by Scrutiny, and the members voted against. I appreciate there's also elements in your motion that relate to engagement from residents, which of course is an important issue. That again was debated at the meeting on Friday, and there was a separate recommendation in relation to having, for example, opposition councillors in the compliance board too, and that motion was again lost. So the difficulty is that the substance of the motion, that is the terms of your topic 4, is the same and has the same effect as the motion that was defeated on Friday.
So, Chair, maybe.
Well, I had Councillor Driver first, and then
It's a specific point on that.
And mine. Well, my point is nearly exactly what you just said. We already gone through this once before the last meeting. We had a vote on it and it was lost to go through this in the scrutiny. I can understand why Councillor Calvin wants to bring it up again, but I think it's already been dealt with at the last meeting and it can't be dealt with again for another 6 months.
Councillor Osborne.
Sorry, just to clarify, does that apply to scrutiny? Because my understanding was that motion, that 6-month rule applied to motions to council, and we don't bring motions to scrutiny.
So can we bring the same recommendation every 2 weeks? It'd be a bit of a waste of time, really, wouldn't it?
Yeah, could answer that question.
So that element of the Constitution is the procedure rules. I appreciate those procedure rules are primarily written with council in mind, but they do apply to the council's committees too. I think if there are areas that we think we can enhance to more effectively apply to the committees, including scrutiny, I'll happily look at that, but the essence of it does apply to the scrutiny committee as well.
Councillor Osborne.
I mean, that seems to be a bit of a grey area, so I want clarity on that.
Right. I'm not, to be perfectly frank with you, I'm not sure at this stage what further clarity you can get other than the council's head of law.
Sort of reading the lines, it's not necessarily clear. I don't have this constitution up in front of me, but we can look at that after the meeting maybe. But just answering the point Keith made, I find it strange to say that they think that this has been talked about and therefore we shouldn't be talking about this again. This is a serious issue that's been uncovered, and we want to make sure that it doesn't happen ever again. And what is scrutiny for if we're not here to examine what's happened and make sure that there's improvements in the future? I also don't see what we're going to lose by this.
We're already involved with what we said last week.
Yeah, there was a resolution at the last meeting to bring. We will be looking at elements of this in the future, in the summer, I believe. Yeah. So it's not something that the particular request from Councillor Galvin was defeated, but there is something that means that this will be coming back to scrutiny, which is a good thing. And we can spend ages arguing about the ins and outs of the specific aspects that people want to be considered, but we have had a process. There's been no vote on it, and we have a constitution that, whether members are in full agreement with the constitution or not, is worded in such a way that allows certain things to be dealt with in a particular way, and they are being dealt with with that way. Constitution Working Party was this afternoon. No doubt there'll be changes to the Constitution coming to full council. If members have specific concerns about the Constitution, then they need to work with the monitoring officer to look at framing changes, to tighten things up, to allow for this meeting, which does operate in a different way to full council, to operate in the way that it could well do. But at the moment, we must be constrained by those rules of engagement that we operate in. Councillor Gow.
Thank you. It's not a good look for a council to use its constitution in this way to stifle scrutiny of a situation as grave as this. I had no idea that a topic form was a motion.
What I will say is we spent considerable time on Friday dealing with an aspect of the serious concerns and that members had, and the serious concerns that members of the public had. But I can't, as chair, change the rules. That is not, there are a number of things that are within my power, but I cannot here today unilaterally say I'm going to change the rules to allow certain things to happen. So we appear to have reached an impasse in terms of what you would like to see go forward and what we're being told is permissible within the rules of the council. This is the situation we find ourselves faced with. Do you have anything that you need to add on?
It's not a point of law or constitution, but I think it's something we've considered earlier, that on Friday you resolved that this comes back to a committee in the summer, the whole topic of housing compliance and the progress the council has made. I wonder if therefore there's the opportunity at that stage to revisit this point specifically on is it now time to look backwards and bring forward those points that Councillor Gowden made, and then the committee can revisit it afresh at that point.
So that could be a way of resolving this. Anyone else have anything you'd like to say at this point? Councillor McAllister, just speak, Councillor.
Just to say, obviously, the next civic year brings other opportunities for scrutiny, and topic forms can be submitted then when we actually know that we've fixed a lot of the issues in place, and can then devote some of that office and resource that is spent currently fixing those issues to ensuring that doesn't occur again.
Councillor Driver.
On the 12% loss rate on our last speech, I didn't understand that. Are we trying to do that through this meeting? Can we just have a rule on it?
No,
yes
there's nothing that needs. There's nothing that needs to be voted on. All that we heard from the monitoring officer was a proposal that you made is ensuring that this item is coming back to scrutiny at some point in the summer. The scope of which I think is to be fully fleshed out, but it might be an appropriate time to look a bit further back. Councillor Stewart.
Yes, I mean, I'm more than happy to have a look at this again when we have the next scrutiny in the summer. I think by prioritising resources to fixing the issue rather than looking back immediately is the right way of doing things, and that should be the council's priority, to put things right first.
Thank you. I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. I think that. Thank